Hey everyone, welcome to Professor Long's Lectures in Anatomy and Physiology. As you guys are aware, we're in the coronavirus or COVID-19 shutdown, and we were forced very rapidly to put our classes from a face-to-face format to an online format. And these series of videos are intended for students taking my biology classes. This is for my Biology 2401 course, which is Human Anatomy and Physiology Part 1. We just wrapped up the muscular system. You guys should be taking the quizzes this week, and today's April 10th. I'm knocking out some of the nervous system videos. We have 2 nervous system exams coming up. They're the last 2 tests for the semester. 1 more lab test coming. So I'm going to be going over the sort of the organization of the nervous system, the big picture of the nervous system, and talking about the different parts of the nervous system. Please follow along. If you're in my class, you can follow along in the note set. We're on page 64, which is a big blank page for you to draw this flow chart of the nervous system. And then we'll go on to the next few lectures after that. The nervous system is extremely complex, similar to the muscular system. It's a lot of detail. You have to pay a lot of attention to some of these details. So now let me get started here. When it comes to our nervous system, and I'm going to use the abbreviation NS for nervous system a lot. We have 2 parts to our nervous system. There's one called the CNS, which stands for Central Nervous System. And there are 2 major components to the central nervous system. If I were to look at it sort of in a diagrammatical way, there's the brain and there's the spinal cord. So the CNS includes our brain and spinal cord. Okay? The CNS, the central nervous system, is where the highest level of information processing goes on. And you can think of it in a simplistic way. Our nervous system evolved from the bottom up. The higher up we go, the more higher and complex the functions, the thinking, and the processing goes. The lower down we go, the more simple and basic. Sort of like the simplest organisms had a spinal cord and a little group of neurons, not much of a brain at all. And then over time, the brain grew and evolved, and we added more to the ancient brain. We have not evolved a different brain. Okay. So now, the CNS is the brain and the spinal cord. It does the highest level of information processing. Now, that doesn't mean that the other part of the nervous system does not, but it doesn't do the same level of information processing. Now, our peripheral nervous system is called the PNS. So our CNS is the central nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is everything out in the periphery. If you think about your peripheral vision, that vision that's way out here, if I'm looking ahead this way, then I have, let me move a little bit. If I'm looking here, I can still see my hand off in this side. And so I have some peripheral vision. My central vision is far more sharp, but I still have some vision out in the periphery. So the peripheral nervous system is that which is out here. And the peripheral nervous system consists of a number of structures. It includes what we call the 12 pairs of cranial nerves. It includes the 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and all of the nerve branches that come off that, because there are many, many, many nerve branches. A nerve will exit our spinal cord and then branch, and then those branches will branch and branch and branch and branch. So usually you know when you're talking about the peripheral nervous system because the word nerve is in the name, like the splanchnic nerve, the phrenic nerve, or whatnot. So now that we have this information down, I'm going to erase part of this peripheral nervous system. You need to know there's 12 pairs of cranial nerves, 12 on the right side and 12 on the left side that come off the cranium and out the skull. There's 31 pairs of spinal nerves coming off the spinal cord, and then all the nerve branches. Now, let me erase this. And I want to talk about the peripheral nervous system because the peripheral nervous system has 2 subdivisions. Okay? The 2 subdivisions of the peripheral nervous system are, one is called the afferent. Let me do it this way. Put a big number 1 here. One is called the afferent nervous system. Now, af means to, and ferre means to carry, like a boat ferry carries cars across the water. So afferent means to carry towards. And one of the things we say about the afferent nervous system, or afferent nervous system, is that it will carry sensory input to the CNS. It is literally carrying information into the central nervous system so that the central nervous system can process that information and then make the appropriate adjustments to preserve homeostasis. So since these are all sensory neurons carrying sensory information into or to the CNS, it's described as the afferent nervous system. There's no reason to have sensory information going out into the periphery, because in the periphery we don't process that sensory information. We wouldn't be able to make sense of it or understand it. So it only goes one way. That, by the way, that sensory information is then going to go up the spinal cord to the brain, to the centers that we need to process. On occasion, we can bypass that in some simple reflexes. Now, in order for us to carry sensory input, we have to receive information. So out in the periphery, we have different types of receptors. These receptors, or sensory receptors, are specialized neurons that have evolved or are designed to detect stimuli or changes in the environment. So I'm going to write a couple of definitions over here, and then I'm going to erase them because I am going to need this space. But a stimulus, if you remember from early in the semester, is any detectable change in the environment. So I'm sitting down in Corpus Christi, Texas. If a car backfires in Houston, Texas, I wouldn't hear that. So the sensory receptors in my ears are not sensitive enough to hear that noise if it's not loud enough. Now, I can hear thunder from hundreds of miles away if it's loud enough and it travels. But nonetheless, if I can't detect it, if my sensory receptors cannot detect it, my body remains largely unaware. So a stimulus is any detectable change in the environment. It's really anything that sets off our receptors in the periphery. Once the receptors can detect it, they will have some electrochemical changes, and they'll send that signal, called an action potential, through the afferent division into the CNS, usually up to our brain, and then we think about it and make decisions about what to do. There's two major categories of these sensory receptor cells, and one of them are called exteroreceptors. Since a receptor is a specialized cell that can detect changes in the environment or detect stimuli, if we are detecting information from the outside world, exteroreceptors are going to detect that information and then send it into our CNS. Exteroreceptors would be things that detect the outside world, like your touch receptors, your smell receptors, your hearing, your vision. That's the outside world. We need to monitor the world around us because if there are threats or changes in that, we need to respond to them. And then there's another class of receptors called interoreceptors. Interoreceptors are going to monitor the internal environment or the inside of the body so we can make appropriate changes. For example, if your bladder was full, you need to go relieve yourself. If your stomach is empty, you need to eat. If you're feeling pain somewhere in your body, like your knee is aching, then you know not to go for a run. If you have a headache, they're monitoring the internal environment. We're going to talk about all the different types of interoreceptors and exteroreceptors later on, but you just need to know the two major classes of receptors. So all of these receptors are detecting changes in the external or outside environment and the internal or inside environment, and then sending through the afferent neurons, afferent nervous system, into the CNS, up to our brain. Our brain and spinal cord do all this information processing and thinking, and then make the appropriate responses. Now, as a biologist, one of the things that you learn over time is that, ultimately all animals are fundamentally designed to do two things, and two things primarily. Everything else is extra. Those two things are to survive as an individual. In order to survive as an individual, if one of my favorite TV shows that I'm watching these days is called Naked and Afraid, where a man and a woman get dropped off. Usually a couple gets dropped off and they don't know each other. Total strangers, totally different parts of the United States. They get dropped off completely naked in the middle of nowhere, the savannas of Africa or the jungles of South America, on a deserted, island somewhere in the cold and deserts. And they have to survive for 21 days like our primitive ancestors. They get one item, usually a machete, and the other one brings something to start a fire or something. And they got to live. They got to figure it out. I love that show because it shows us a lot about our physiology and how we evolved. So if you were dropped off in the middle of nowhere, you got to monitor the world around you. First and foremost, you got to find things to eat. You have to consume food for energy and to heal grow your body. And you have to avoid becoming food for other predators. So survival of the individual is first and foremost. We are constantly scanning the world around us. Even at a subconscious level, our brain is processing information, trying to determine, is this situation safe? If it's safe, if it does not threaten my ability to survive as an individual, I don't have to do anything. I can just chill. If there's something that would give me an advantage to survive, then I can act on it. So if I see something crawl by and I'm starving, I can pick up a rock or try to grab it and kill it and consume it. If it decreases my chances of survival, I better change something. If there's, if I'm out hunting looking for food and I hear a noise, I turn around and it's a lion, I've got to decide, am I going to run for my life or am I going to fight for my life, or how am I going to survive? So we're constantly scanning the world around us to check for survival of the individual. Do the circumstances I face increase or decrease my chances of survival? If they increase it, great. If they decrease it, I better fix it. I better have some kind of response to increase my chances to survive. The second major function of all animals is to survive as a species. And what that means is find a mate and make as many offspring as you possibly can, so that when you're dead and gone, your DNA is somewhere alive. Some of your DNA goes into your offspring, and somehow, some way, you're still kind of existing in the universe in your offspring. And in most animals, the offspring don't live to adulthood, so they mate frequently and make as many babies as they can. In primitive societies, your workforce that helps the village, that helps the tribe survive, is the population. So, since most kids in a very agrarian society would not live, back in the 17 and 1800s, most kids didn't live past the age of 5, and some that didn't make it past the age of 15. So if you wanted to have offspring, you had to have a whole bunch, 7, 8, 10, 12, 15, 20 kids. If you were a farmer in early United States and you had a big chunk of land and you were a homesteader, that was your workforce. That was the people working the fields and growing crops and milking cows and doing all the work, building and chopping and all that. So you had lots of children. Nowadays, children are super expensive. Okay, they take a toll on your ability to survive and reproduce by the consumption of goods and the cost. So it's not quite the same as it used to be. So now we have fewer and fewer and fewer children because more and more of them are making it to adulthood. But ultimately, all animals do that. They look for mates, and when it's mating season, boy, they mate as often as they can to try to make sure that they have healthy and vibrant offspring. And we are constantly scanning the world to do that. Regardless of how committed you are in a relationship, we are biologically programmed that if someone walks by, you check, is that the gender that you find attractive? And if so, do they have the traits you find attractive? There's not a woman I know in this world that could replace the value that my wife adds to my life. Just cannot. No offense to anyone else, but what she brings to the table for me in our relationship is amazing. That doesn't mean if a pretty girl walks by, you can't help but notice. And, we have this general reaction to, observe somebody. As a matter of fact, if I were standing here lecturing and there was another person standing here, regardless of their gender, and they were standing, even if they were very unattractive and they were standing here naked, you couldn't help while you're looking at me every now and then look over and go, oh my God. We are biologically driven to survive as an individual and then survive as a species. Food and mates. Okay, so knowing that's what these receptors are doing. Now, when we're scanning the world, if what we're doing increases our chances of surviving as an individual or as a species, we want to continue that behavior. So if you're a guy trying to attract some girls or other guys or whatever you're into, and what you're doing is getting the attention you want, you keep doing it. if what you're doing is turning away those people that you were trying to attract, you change your behavior. That's what leads us to the other part of the nervous system. So ultimately, our peripheral nervous system has two subdivisions. The afferent division, which is going to have extero and interoreceptors monitoring the world around us, making sure we're safe for survival and or reproduction. And then they send that information into our CNS, and we decide, are these conditions helping out? Now, I'm going to write the other half of the nervous system over here because it gets a little bit more complex when it comes to the second part. Okay, so we know we do information processing in the brain and spinal cord in the CNS. Okay, the second half of the nervous system, or the peripheral nervous system, remember, it has two subdivisions. The second subdivision is called the efferent division, or the efferent nervous system. Sometimes we'll say the afferent division and the afferent nervous system and the efferent division or efferent nervous system. They're part of your PNS, or peripheral nervous system. F means away, and what the efferent division does is it will carry motor commands to what we call effectors, which is muscles. They're going to give us the desired effect. They're going to make the appropriate adjustments for survival. And it carries those motor commands away from the CNS. So once we do all of our thinking up here and we decide this is the appropriate behavior or reaction that I need to increase my chances to survive or reproduce, then some neurons are going to send information down from the cerebral cortex, usually or somewhere high up, down the spinal cord, and then that's going to carry information out to our effectors so we can have the appropriate response. Okay? Now, the efferent division has two subdivisions. And by the way, when I say muscles, I mean skeletal muscle. Like if you put your hand on a hot stove, or if you step off a curb and see a car coming, you can jump back. That's protecting you. If you're trying to attract someone, then you see someone attractive walk by, you might change your behavior to get their attention or make them smile or laugh or something. But it also includes cardiac muscle, and it also includes smooth muscle or visceral muscle. They have to make the appropriate adjustments also, and that's what we're going to get to. So in the efferent division itself, I'm going to erase this motor commands because I need as much space as I can get here. But essentially, the efferent division is going to carry motor commands to our muscles, to our effectors. So the efferent division itself has two subdivisions. Okay. One of those subdivisions is called the somatic nervous system. The word soma means body, and this is going to move our body. So the somatic nervous system, or the somatic division, is going to control skeletal muscle. And that skeletal muscle is also called voluntary muscle. You should learn in lab that skeletal muscle is voluntary muscle. Our brain has to tell it to contract. It is volunteered by the brain. So if I put my hand on a hot stove and I move my hand away, or if a ball is coming at my head and I move my head to avoid getting hurt, that would be a somatic nervous system firing on my skeletal muscle to protect me. Okay. Now, the second subdivision of the efferent nervous system is called the autonomic nervous system. Now, the autonomic nervous system I tend to think of as the automatic nervous system. These are the things that happen whether we want them to or not. And the autonomic nervous system is going to control, essentially it's going to control smooth muscle and cardiac muscle. Okay, this is where it's going to start to get interesting, but this is really one of the most important things for you guys to know is this autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is going to play a huge role in a lot of the things that we do in Part 2A and P. It's going to affect our endocrine and cardiovascular and digestive and respiratory and urinary and reproductive systems. Now, the reason I left a big gap here is it's not quite so simple, because the autonomic nervous system itself has two subdivisions, okay? And those two subdivisions are going to be what we call the sympathetic nervous system, and the other one is going to be called the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, I couldn't fit those all on a line. I couldn't write it all out. but we have sympathetic and parasympathetic. Okay? So before I finish all of this, there's so much that I need to write that I really need some more space. So you guys should have a big picture here, but ultimately the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system are both going to control smooth and cardiac muscle. And they are both, we're going to toggle between these two nervous systems to adjust the activities of these to meet the demands of the skeletal system, of our somatic nervous system. So I'm going to go into that in great detail. Let me just erase this and make some room, and I'm really just going to redraw the efferent division and do a little bit more detail here. Okay? So, erase all this. And before I even get into all of this, again, this is part of the peripheral nervous system. Before I even get into all of this, I need to give you a kind of a conceptual idea of what's going on. This picture to me explains a tremendous amount. I was trying to understand all of this when I was a student, an undergraduate, and I happened to be watching an old cowboy movie, and this came to me. It really all fell into place, and so now I've shared it with my classmates when I was a student and with my students, and it helps you think your way in a simplistic way through what's going on in the body. So before I get back to the autonomic nervous system, let me just show you this. If you ever watch an old school movie and you see an old school train, I'm going to draw a very simplistic one, but here's a choo-choo train. Old Western movie. And this train can have a whole bunch of wheels, but there's usually a really large wheel back here where they drive the train. Okay? And they usually have a giant smokestack coming out of here, right? And that's where all the smoke billows out. Now, inside these were called steam engines because they utilized steam. And let me increase the size of this so that I can try to get my picture. Now, this is going to be a very crude drawing. Just try to follow along. In here is a giant boiler. They had a fire underneath this. And this little fire in here would cause a lot of water in this tank to boil. And as you know, when we boil water, it forms steam, and the steam will rise. The hot air rises, and as the steam rises from this boiler, it would go up a couple of simple tubes. I'm just going to draw two here. These tubes could have openings up at the top where the steam could escape. If I block up the tube with a metal cylinder, and these cylinders were attached to some arms so that as they rise with the pressure, as the steam rises, that steam is going to push up on these cylinders and push them up. And it was designed so that when one rises, when it hits that opening, all the steam would be let off, and the pressure would go away, and the piston or cylinder would fall back down while the other one's going up, and then it would do that. I know I look like a dork doing that, but it's really what was happening in those trains. It was the steam pushing the pistons. And it turns out that those pistons were attached to this wheel, and the faster the pistons were going up and down, the faster the wheel went, controlling all the other wheels. So essentially, to make the train go faster, I need a hotter fire. If I want the train to slow down, I let the fire burn out, or I could put it out, and the train would come to a stop because the wheels would stop turning and slow down. So there was usually two guys in the train. One was the engineer that calculated the distances and how much speed and everything and how much fuel we're going to need. And then the other one was the fireman. I'm going to put the fireman in here. The fireman essentially was someone who took a shovel and shoveled coal into the fire. And if you ever look at these old school choo-choo trains, the car right behind it was a coal car, piled up with tons of coal, as much coal and carbon that they needed to burn. You got to have a carbon substance to burn. In our body, by the way, this coal car would be the liver, and it would be the glycogen and skeletal muscle, but the liver stores a bunch of it as well. So this is glycogen. Glycogen is how we lump a whole bunch of sugar molecules together. And as you should know from early in the semester, in order to make energy, I have to have the sugar glucose, a simple sugar, in the presence of oxygen and mitochondria of my cells to make all the energy that I need. I get some carbon dioxide and some water out of this. This is energy metabolism in a nutshell. If I burn sugar, I can burn it without oxygen, but I only get 2 ATP, and that's not enough energy for our body. But if I add oxygen in mitochondria, they have the enzymes to convert the sugar and oxygen into a whole lot more energy. I get a lot more energy from one molecule of glucose. So this is my carbon source, C6H12O6, like the coal in the train. But the other thing I need is oxygen. And so my respiratory system is going to pull oxygen out of the atmosphere, and that's going to get pumped into the fire as well. As you know, you need oxygen and carbon to make a fire. And so not only was the fireman shoveling glucose into the engine, he also had a thing called a bellows. Kind of looks like an accordion that comes to a point. You've seen them in fireplaces that blow air. So you'd have to stick your face next to a big hot fire. So this guy was actually providing the glucose and the oxygen, or the coal and the oxygen, to make the fire hotter. If I need my train to go faster, this guy's got to be shoveling a lot of oxygen and glucose into the tissues. So the fireman really represents your heart. And the train itself represents your brain. When our brain is extremely active and we're thinking a whole lot, we get exhausted. It burns a tremendous amount of energy. As a matter of fact, your 3-pound brain burns as much energy in a minute as 60 pounds of muscle can. So it's burning more energy than muscle. It also represents skeletal muscle in a nutshell. So if my body is going 90 miles an hour, if I'm exercising, if I'm running for my life from a dog chasing me, if I'm fighting for my life or boxing, I'm going to burn a tremendous amount of energy, and I'm constantly thinking my way through. If I'm not under stress, if I'm relaxed, these guys are at a low level of activity. When you go to sleep, your brain shuts down, your skeletal muscles are not active, we're burning less energy. So this is our somatic nervous system. The somatic nervous system is controlling skeletal muscle. Now, the autonomic nervous system is going to be all of this. This is my simplistic way of thinking of this. Ultimately, this is somatic over here, and this is autonomic over here. Now, how do I get the glucose? I have to eat. That's my digestive system. And as I'm getting it, every now and then, so there's some trash and waste, I have to make waste. So when I start thinking about my autonomic nervous system, I think about this train. And this is going to be cardiac muscle, your heart, and smooth muscle that's going to be increasing, well, not just smooth muscle, but some of your smooth muscle, which is going to make all your secretions and digestion and all of this other stuff. So when my skeletal muscle is in high levels of activity, when the somatic nervous system is firing like crazy, my autonomic nervous system is going to kick on. And I'm going to get some varied effects. The heart and the respiratory system are going to go into high gear. My heart rate's going to beat harder and faster. I'm going to start breathing, huffing and puffing, getting more oxygen in, getting the carbon dioxide out. So all of this stuff increases. My brain activity increases. My skeletal muscle activity increases. My heart, my breathing increases. Now, if I'm running for my life or fighting for my life, I can't stop and worry about going to the restroom or having a meal. So everything kind of down here, digestion, urinary and waste function, and reproductive functions shut down. So the autonomic nervous system will ramp up cardiac muscle activity and then alter the smooth muscle to meet the demands of the somatic nervous system. If this is in high gear, then this has to do one thing. If this is in low gear, slowing down and coming to a stop where we can eat, go to the restroom, take a nap, then all of this will change. My heart rate and my breathing rate slow, and then my digestive system can kick on. So that's your autonomic nervous system, is the sympathetic and parasympathetic. Sympathetic is going to increase heart rate and oxygen and breathing and all of that flow of oxygen and glucose and to my skeletal muscle in my brain. So I'm going to get dilated blood vessels going to my muscle, going to my brain, going to my heart and lungs. Because my digestive and urinary and reproductive systems are in low levels of activity, then when I'm in sympathetic stimulation, all of those shut off. I'm going to constrict blood vessels back to a minimum so that I can divert all the blood where I need it for survival. Then when I get to a nice safe place and all this calms down, I can switch my autonomic to parasympathetic nervous system. The parasympathetic nervous system is going to lower breathing and heart rate and all this activity, and it's going to raise all the activity below the diaphragm, essentially. It's a simple way of thinking of it, although there's not a real distinct boundary. But it's going to increase digestive function. So I'm going to make more saliva. I'm going to start to make all my digestive enzymes and get my digestive tract functioning, make waste, and all of those things. So autonomic is going to toggle between sympathetic and parasympathetic depending on how hard my somatic nervous system is working. So I think of this choo-choo train in that way. If this train is going 90 miles an hour, I better produce more energy. I better start huffing and puffing and pumping all that oxygen and glucose and dilating all the blood vessels going to these organs. That's sympathetic activation. Under parasympathetic activation, this slows down. So all of this slows down, and then I can step off the train, I can have a meal, I can eat, I can take a nap, you can go to the restroom, you can, mate with somebody. It's rest and digest and reproduce. It's not quite that simplistic, but that's the big picture. So I'm going to write out those details for you, but I think this picture helps us think about that. Under sympathetic activation, the liver will release glucose, the heart starts pumping the blood enriched with glucose into our muscles and our brain, and oxygen from the atmosphere, I have to breathe faster so I can pump that. Under parasympathetic, my liver can fill back up with glycogen as I eat. I can go to the restroom, I can rest and digest. Okay? So let me erase all this and let me really do the details so that you guys can see what are some of the things you need to focus on. Okay? So when it comes to the autonomic nervous system, the autonomic nervous system has two subdivisions itself. There's sympathetic nervous system. I always think sympathetic feels sorry. It has sympathy because you're about to die. It's a stress situation. So the sympathetic nervous system, it's not always quite that extreme, but it's a simple way to think of it. And then there's parasympathetic nervous system. Okay? Now, the autonomic nervous system will toggle between these two based upon the needs of the somatic nervous system. So, sympathetic nervous system is often thought of as fight or flight system. You're going to fight for your life or flee for your life. And so, it is active during stress, or we can say high levels of brain and skeletal muscle. I'm going to abbreviate skeletal as an SK activities. So when my brain and my skeletal muscle are going 90 miles an hour, I'm going to toggle over to sympathetic. Some of the major effects of the sympathetic nervous system is it's going to increase heart rate. You'll see me abbreviate heart rate as HR a whole lot in the future. It will increase blood pressure. Sorry, I'm drawing a blank for a second. I was confusing the two in my mind. So that's going to be BP. It's going to increase breathing rate and depth of breathing, or increased respiration, we should say. It's going to increase blood flow to skeletal muscle, brain, heart. I try to draw a picture of the heart, but it's hard to write on the bottom of the board, and your lungs, for the most part. Skeletal muscle, brain, heart, and lungs. It's going to decrease a bunch of other things. So since I'm running out of room, I'm going to write some of this stuff over here, and then we'll compare and contrast the two. So let me erase some of this. I'm going to rewrite all of this a little bit neater. Okay? Sympathetic, fight or flight, stress. And by the way, there's good stress like exercise and sex with someone that you care about. And then there's bad stress, which would be things like, if you've got an exam coming and you haven't studied, if your job is not good, if you know you're about to get into a fight with someone, you're being chased by a dog. So there's good and bad stress. So fight or flight. When we kick into fight or flight, what we need to do is we need to increase heart rate. We need increased blood pressure. We need increased breathing rate. And the depth of breathing. We need to increase blood flow to brain, heart, lungs, and skeletal muscle. So essentially what's going to happen is we're going to dilate those blood vessels. We're going to relax the smooth muscle in the walls of our blood vessels to increase blood flow to all these things. We're also going to relax the smooth muscle in the respiratory tree and dilate the tubes so we get more airflow in and out. What it's going to decrease is it's going to decrease digestive function. So when you're stressed, your mouth dries up because you quit secreting saliva and you lose your appetite. You know, if you get in a fight with your significant other right before you're going to go to dinner, you have an argument, and you say, what do you want to go eat? I'm not hungry now. Well, okay, there you go. So it decreases digestive function. It decreases waste function. So your kidneys filter slower and we produce less waste. Your digestive system isn't going to produce waste. When people are very stressed for long periods of time, they don't urinate as frequently. They become constipated or don't defecate as frequently. And it's going to decrease reproductive function. Okay? And what that means is it's going to be harder to make all the secretions that we need for reproduction. That's kind of the big picture. It's also going to decrease, so when we know fight or flight, when we know sympathetic nervous system, we understand the parasympathetic nervous system because it is the exact opposite of this. Parasympathetic is referred to as rest and repose, and to repose means to digest. Rest and digest. Or I say rest, digest, and reproduce. And it's going to be active during low levels of stress. Decreased stress, okay? I know my penmanship's not the best here. I'm trying to be neat so that you guys can read this. But it really is active during low levels of stress. Now, I'm going to erase all that. But the parasympathetic nervous system, called rest and digest, is active when we're not stressed. That's when you can sleep. That's when you can digest your food. So, under rest and digest, I'm going to take the exact same categories, but I'm just going to flip the arrows. This is going to decrease heart rate and blood pressure. It's going to decrease respiration. When you're sleeping, you don't breathe as rapidly. You never hear someone snore. It's long, slow breaths. It's going to decrease blood flow to all of these structures. And one of the things I should say is that under sympathetic nervous system, it will decrease blood flow to the digestive and reproductive tracts and the urinary system as well. So once I know these functions, I know these functions. It'll decrease blood flow to the brain and to skeletal muscle, to the heart, and to the lungs. So if you eat a big bowl of pasta, or let's say, this drives me nuts. My students hear me talk about this a lot. But if you have kids, I have teenagers that are very active in a lot of sports. They're superstars in their sports. Really, when I go to a tournament, if we were at a baseball tournament or right before a football game, and I see a kid pounding down a couple of hot dogs and a slice of pizza, well, guess what their body's going to do? It's going to switch to parasympathetic. They're going to have decreased heart rate and blood pressure. They're going to have decreased blood flow to the brain. They're not going to be thinking as rapidly. Their skeletal muscles will become very sluggish. And then their parents yell at them for missing a ball or not, reacting fast enough. And it's silly because they just activated their parasympathetic nervous system. You need to eat brain food before an exam and before, something light and and that has easy sugar to burn, like some fruit and some granola and things. Anyway, if I know all of the sympathetic nervous system, I know the parasympathetic nervous system. I simply flip the arrows. And over here, it's going to increase digestive function. It's going to increase waste function. It's going to increase reproductive function. It's going to increase blood flow to the digestive, reproductive, and urinary tract so I can clean out the blood. I'm not going to write all that out, but we should be able to make a chart of that. As a matter of fact, I know this video is getting long, but let me take 5 minutes and let me do it this way. Okay, there's an easy way to do this with a table. So we can put things like heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, breathing, brain activity, blood flow to brain, heart, and skeletal muscle. We could put lungs in there as well. And then we can put blood flow to the digestive, urinary, and repro systems. We can put in digestive activity or digestion, waste function, and reproductive function. I could put sympathetic here. I could put parasympathetic over here. Okay? And all I have to do is do the arrows. For sympathetic, I'm going to increase heart rate. I'm going to increase blood pressure. I'm going to increase respiration. I'm going to increase brain activity and skeletal muscle activity. I'm going to increase blood flow to all of these organs. I'm going to decrease digestive function. I'm going to decrease blood flow to the urinary, reproductive, and digestive systems. I'm going to increase digestive function. I'm going to decrease. I'm going to decrease waste function. I'm going to decrease reproductive function. Okay, in a nutshell. Therefore, over here, I can flip my arrows. Parasympathetic is going to decrease heart rate, blood pressure, breathing rate, brain and skeletal muscle activity, and blood flow to those organs. Because they're not consuming as much energy, I don't need to send the oxygen and glucose there to the bloodstream. I'm going to increase all of these things. Now that's kind of in a nutshell. There's a whole lot more that goes on. For example, under sympathetic, your palms get sweaty, your pits start sweating, you get nervous, right? So it will increase sweat gland activity. Your pupils will dilate. Under parasympathetic, your pupils will constrict and your hands get cold and clammy. You don't sweat as much. So there's a lot more going on than this, but this is the big picture, the simplified way to think about it. And then now you can plug all the details into this. You must understand the flow of information through the nervous system. You need to know that the CNS is the brain and the spinal cord. They do central processing, the highest level of thinking. The peripheral nervous system has two subdivisions. Afferent, which carries sensory input from the extero and interoreceptors outside and inside the body into the CNS so they can make sense of that. And then how we react is going to be based upon whether we need to make changes or not. So as the information comes out of the CNS going out to our effectors, our muscles, and that includes skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and all the smooth muscle here in our blood vessels, it needs to make changes depending on the skeletal muscle activity and the brain activity. So if the somatic nervous system is under high levels of activity, we toggle over to sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight. It increases all of these things. Okay. If the efferent division is going to fire low levels of somatic activity, our skeletal muscles aren't working, we're resting, then I can toggle my autonomic nervous system over to parasympathetic. So both the somatic and the autonomic nervous system, they're subdivisions of the PNS, of the efferent division of the PNS. Both of those are functioning at the same time. But depending upon the activity of the somatic system, the autonomic nervous system toggles between these two to meet the energy demands. Again, it's a big picture, simplified way to think about it. You should be able to draw the flow chart of the nervous system in all one picture, and you should know the functions of the autonomic nervous system. Every time you hear autonomic, you should think sympathetic, parasympathetic. Sympathetic means one reaction in the body. Parasympathetic usually means the opposite. Got it? Now, I know this was kind of a long video. It's about 45 minutes, but it really is. I really want to present all that to you because we're going to come back to it. You must know this backwards and forwards because we're going to come to it over and over and over again for the rest of your career in both anatomy and physiology as well as in healthcare. It's a huge deal. We'll get into more detail on sympathetic and parasympathetic in future lectures. All right? I hope you learned something. I hope you had as much fun as I did. I always have a blast talking about this stuff. I absolutely love it. And I hope it was helpful. So if you're in my class, we simply covered page 64 in the note set. If you're not in my class, I hope it was helpful. I'll see you guys on the flip side in the next series of videos. So thanks for watching.